Hello friends, welcome back to Children's Liturgy. Let's start our time together with a prayer, and it's from one of my favorite books, and we've said lots of prayers from this book. And I'll just ask Tim if he'd like to zoom in on a copy of the prayer that I wrote so that you can pray with me. So let's say this prayer together. God, whose glory fills the whole world and who is with us wherever we go, protect us in our daily lives and travels. Surround us with your loving care. Guard us from every danger and bring us safely into the day's end. Amen. I like this picture of the two children, whether they're friends or brothers or sisters, neighbors, cousins, walking together. It's so good to have people we love who walk with us on our journey, whether it's just walking to school or walking all the way through life. It's wonderful to have people who love us and care about us. And sometimes that's a nice way to think about God's Holy Spirit, just a comforting arm around you as you walk down the path of life. I'm going to put this aside for just a moment, and we'll take a quick look at the coloring sheet and the bulletin for today. The front of our bulletin is a phrase from one of the Psalms, Psalm 99, and this says, "Let us praise your great and awesome name." I don't know if you've ever said, "Oh God, I think you're awesome," but you might feel that way sometime. Maybe you have a wonderful experience or you see something remarkable in the world, something full of God's creation or love or creativity. You might want to say, just like the psalmist did, that we praise your great and awesome name. The coloring sheet is from our reading today from the Gospel of Matthew. And this is a really famous story that we often hear this particular phrase from this part of the Gospel. And there were some people who were in power at the time that Jesus was busy in his own ministry. And these people sometimes weren't quite sure what Jesus was up to. They were a little suspicious about whether or not he wanted to be in power. And so sometimes people would try to ask him a question, maybe just to trick him a little bit. And they were asking him, what do we owe to the emperor? And what do we owe to God? And Jesus said that you can be responsible and give to the emperor or to the government what you owe the government. And sometimes we call that word taxes. And even in ancient times, people had to pay taxes. And just because you pay some money to the government doesn't mean that you also don't hold God very dear and close and maybe first in your heart. So he wasn't going to let anybody trick him and get him too flustered. In church on Sunday, the very song that we sing at the beginning of our church service this coming Sunday is, "I have decided to follow Jesus." And part of that song is that there's no turning back, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me. That following God is the most important thing. And we still take care of our worldly responsibilities. But that doesn't mean that God and God's love isn't first in our heart, even when we're making choices about what we do in our community. So I thought about this encounter. Have you heard that word before, encounter, when maybe two different people come together and something important is happening? And there's a phrase that we sometimes talk about when maybe a very powerful person is talking to someone who isn't very powerful, and that person that maybe doesn't seem like they are very powerful, they might have something really important to say. They might have something very truthful and important to say. And so sometimes we say that sometimes it's important for us to speak truth to power. I have a book that I'm going to share with you today about a whole city of people who spoke truth to power. And this is a true story. It happened in our country. It happened back in 1955 and 1956. And that probably sounds like a really, really long time ago to most of you. But there are many of us who were born at that time or just about to be born at that time. And we remember these stories. And I want to share this story with you because it's called Pies from Nowhere, which of course that caught my attention because you know how I love a good pie. But the book is about someone who was a leader in the civil rights movement. And I'm going to have Tim come around so I can read you the story. And we're going to learn about this wonderful woman named Georgia Gilmore. Pies from Nowhere, how Georgia Gilmore sustained the Montgomery bus boycott. When Georgia Gilmore was a young girl, she lived on a farm in Alabama where she fed the pigs and milked the cows. Georgia did her best to listen to what her mother taught her. Think twice before doing anything you might regret, and never ever hate anyone. Georgia grew up and soon had a family of her own. She did plenty of cooking along the way, and when it was time for something sweet, she knew just what to do. She'd blend butter and sugar in a bowl to get her homemade pound cake started, and then add tea bags to a pot of water for a new batch of sweet tea. Georgia was a cook at the National Lunch Company in downtown Montgomery, Alabama. Because of segregation laws, the restaurant counter was separated into two sections. One side for white customers, one side for black customers. Georgia knew it was wrong, but that was the way things had always been. On December 1st, 1955, Georgia was working at the restaurant when a news alert came over the radio. An African-American woman named Rosa Parks had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger. Rosa was tired of giving in to rules that were unjust, and she wasn't the only one. The next day, a flyer was passed around the black community in Montgomery asking people to boycott public transportation on Monday. It said, "Please stay off of all buses." Georgia watched as buses drove down the street one after another. Empty, empty, empty. Because she'd been treated poorly by the drivers so many times before, Georgia hadn't ridden the buses for 2 months. Still, she wanted to be part of the movement she saw growing. Not long after, she went to Holt Street Baptist Church to hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak. The church was full. The crowd overflowed onto the street outside. Large speakers had been set up so everyone could hear. Dr. King spoke about doing good things for one another. He talked about freedom, unity, equality. We are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Those were things Georgia believed in, and she was willing to fight for them. So Georgia decided to help the best way she knew how. She worked with a group of women, and together they purchased the supplies they needed: bread, lettuce, and chickens. And then off they went to cook. The women brought food to the meetings that followed at the church. They sold sandwiches. They sold dinners in their neighborhoods. As the bus boycotters walked and walked, Georgia cooked and cooked. And boy, did the people of Montgomery love her food. Georgia's group donated the profits from their sales to the Montgomery Improvement Association, which helped fund the boycott. But if anyone had found out these women were involved, they could have lost their jobs. So Georgia ran the operation, and the other women acted as secret helpers. See, the way I figured it, people always had to eat, so I made the pies, said Georgia. The women sold baked goods to local stores, groceries, laundromats, and beauty shops, and people paid in cash so they wouldn't be connected to aiding the boycott. And here's a list of what kind of pies are in these boxes: sweet potato pie, peach pie, red velvet cake, 7-Up cake. Only Georgia knew who baked them, and only Georgia knew who bought them. Every Monday and Thursday, Georgia would go early to the boycott strategy meetings at the church. She'd walk up to the collection plate and announce how much her group was contributing. There was cheering, clapping, foot stomping. But whenever people asked where the money came from, she remembered her promise to keep it a secret. It came from nowhere, she'd say. Because of this, her brave group of women bakers became known as the Club from Nowhere. The club not only raised enough to purchase gas for the carpool system that had been set up for the boycott, but they were also able to buy station wagons to aid the effort and help people get where they needed to go. But Montgomery didn't want their buses continuing to lose money, so the city did what it could to stop the protesters and their efforts. Dr. King and 89 others were arrested for their roles in the boycott, and Georgia was called to speak in court about an instance when a bus driver had mistreated her. After she had already paid, the driver demanded she get off and enter through the back of the bus. When I reached the back door and was about to get on, he shut the back door and pulled off, and I didn't even ride the bus after paying my fare. So I decided right then and there I wasn't going to ride the buses anymore, Georgia testified. Georgia knew she was doing the right thing by standing up for her fellow protesters, but the news of the trial spread across the country like wildfire. When the National Lunch Company found out she was part of the boycott, she was fired from her job. Georgia was unemployed and raising 6 children on her own. She needed to find a new way to support her family. Dr. King encouraged her to start her own business. All these years you've worked for somebody else. Now it's time you worked for yourself, he said. He helped her improve the kitchen in her home, and Georgia got new pots and pans and cooking supplies. Word soon got around, and people came to eat at Georgia's. When they came to her house for a meal, they would eat wherever they could find a seat. And if they couldn't find a seat, they'd eat standing up. Georgia loved to talk and joke with her customers and friends. Soon enough, there were long lines to get a meal cooked by her. People ordered meals for delivery, too. Georgia was making hundreds of lunches each day. She packed up fried chicken, black-eyed peas with okra, fresh corn muffins, and apple pie, and sent her kids out to deliver them. If you were lucky, you might even get her homemade macaroni and cheese. She was providing good food for her community, but she was also bringing the people of Montgomery together, black and white. Dr. King frequently had meals at Georgia's house. Because she was a big woman with a big personality, he lovingly called her Tiny. And because civil rights leaders knew they could trust Georgia, her home became a place for important and often secret meetings. "I just served 'em and let 'em talk," she'd say. On November 13th, 1956, Georgia was cooking in her kitchen listening to music on the radio when the station interrupted the song to deliver the news. The Supreme Court had declared that segregation on buses was illegal. The boycotters had won. Georgia was thrilled. People could ride the bus and sit anywhere they desired. At the next church meeting, Georgia sat in her seat and listened as Dr. King announced that the Montgomery bus boycott was a success. "We didn't have to walk no more," said Georgia. "Even before Martin Luther King Jr. got up there and told us it was over, we knew it was over, and we knew we had won." Still, there would be more battles to fight, so Georgia Gilmore kept right on cooking. And at the very end of this book, you can see there's a recipe that is one of Georgia's famous recipes for pound cake that people loved that she made. So that is the story of the pies from nowhere. There's so much of this story that was new to me. I knew a lot about the bus boycott from knowing the story about Rosa Parks. You might have heard about Rosa Parks before. And if you remember, Rosa Parks worked as a seamstress. Here's a picture of her at her sewing machine. She was known for being a wonderful seamstress. And then there was that day, December 1st, 1955, when she was riding the bus and she decided not to move, that she would stay where she was, and then she was arrested because she didn't give her seat up for a white person. This is a picture of her riding on the bus after the bus boycott was over, when she could sit wherever she wanted. You can see she has such a nice smile. But this is a picture I wanted Tim to zoom in on for us. These are real photographs. They're old photographs from the actual boycott. You can see people are walking to their jobs, even on rainy days. Many people had to walk. And these are the people who provided the free rides for other people. So there, in the book, when it talked about people having meetings and organizing, one of the things they organized was a way to help people to get where they needed to go if they couldn't ride the bus. So a lot of times people would get organized at their churches, and they would volunteer their time and give people rides. And you can see this gentleman is opening the door for the ladies to get in, and he's going to give them a ride. And here is a bus, and it is empty because the people decided they were going to walk and not ride the bus until the laws got changed. I have another picture to show you. This is the real bus that Rosa Parks was on. And if you were to go to the Civil Rights Museum, you would see this bus. And here's 2 more pictures I want to show you. So this is a real photograph of Georgia Gilmore, the lady who was the wonderful cook. And this is the house that she lived in where people would come to eat, and she did all of her cooking. And you can see there's a special sign out front, and this is a marker to show what important things happened there at her house during this part, the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. So let me see if there, I was going to tell you, just make sure I don't leave anything really important out. Oh, I know what I was going to tell you. So George's house is in Montgomery, and we know it became a safe meeting place for many of the civil rights leaders. And I read that in later years, Dr. King even brought Robert Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson to George's house. And when President John Kennedy was the president, he even ordered some takeout food from her house, and they took it on Air Force One, which is the president's airplane. So we know she was a wonderful cook, that people loved the food that she made. One of the things that I really appreciate about this story is the idea of how many people it took to make this important change happen. It took so many people. Do you remember when she went to the church and there were so many people gathered for that meeting that they had to put a speaker outside so that the people who were standing outside the church building could hear Dr. King and all the people inside? So sometimes really big important changes and things can be inspired by 1 or 2 people, but it usually takes many, many people to work a long time and work hard to make important changes happen. The other thing I like is that she used the talent that she had, which was for cooking, and I think she really enjoyed it too. So she used her talent and what she loved to do to make a big difference. And she included lots of other people, and she kind of created this whole team of wonderful cooks who helped keep the community fed. I think this was a new part of the story for me. I didn't realize that some of the money that she raised, that they bought the cars, that sometimes they maybe needed a few more cars to give people a ride to work. So this was a long boycott, and the boycott means that they stopped using the service of the bus. It took over a year for things to change, and people had to keep each other strong and encouraged along the way. So I want to show you one other book, and when you finish watching this video, you can tell your parents that there's a movie that we're going to show you the link to the movie, and it's based on this book about Rosa Parks, and this is a really good story and it's a really good movie, but it's for older students, okay? So this is a sort of thing that if you're maybe a 4th or 5th grader, I would say, but it's kind of long. But this is a really good story telling the story about Rosa Parks and the beginning of the boycott and the civil rights movement. And the lady who wrote this book, Nikki Giovanni, is also the person who narrates the story in the movie. So I hope if you are an older student or you're a parent, you might take a minute and look at this. So let's go back and just think a minute. What does it mean for us to be followers of Jesus in a time or in the world when maybe there are laws that aren't always good laws, that aren't always fair to all people? What do we do? What do we do? Well, the people in this story, the people who started the civil rights movement, they gathered together and they prayed and they talked to each other and they tried to make a change. And they tried to make a change following Jesus, following his example, and tried to make it non-violently. That means they didn't want to fight other people. They wanted to fight in a way that meant they would say what was important, they would speak the truth, but they didn't want to fight anybody and punch them or hurt them, but they wanted to say what was true. So when we hear these stories about even all the way back to Jesus in the ancient times, sometimes saying what's true might take a lot of courage, because maybe you're saying what's true and you don't really have any power. You might not be in charge. The people who were in the black community at the time of the civil rights movement in the 50s, most of them did not have a lot of power in their city. But when they worked together and they followed the example of Dr. King and who was following the example of Jesus, they were able to make a change together. So that's a lot of big stuff to think about. But we're at a time right now in our country where people are thinking about big, important things. It's never too early to think about that. It's never too early to say to God, God, I want you to be with me on every step of my journey. Help keep me safe and bring me home safely. And wrap your arms around me so that I can take the next step and the next step. I hope you will have a wonderful week, and I hope that you might find a story, just like I found this story that had lots of new parts that I was excited to learn about. I hope you might find a story or an idea that makes you excited to learn and go deeper into knowing and understanding your world, your heart, your ideas, and never forget, let your love shine, let your light shine. I'll see you again very soon. Goodbye, my friends.